So one thing I wanted to get into, and Lucas, we got introduced by a mutual friend who said, I have a friend who's a paleontologist, and maybe you might want to show a dinosaur movie. And I suggested, well, birds are dinosaurs, right? We could show the birds. And then I thought, wait a minute, birds are dinosaurs? What the hell is up with that? How are birds dinosaurs? This can't be true, right?
Well, somehow, yes. So, yeah, we've known this for about 30 years now, approximately. So, since the 1970s or so, a lot of people started looking at bird anatomy, their skeleton, and trying to think, the skull, the articulation of various bones kind of look very similar to birds. Some of them kind of have proto-wings that might be somehow related. But it wasn't until the late 80s that a lot of dinosaurs discovered in China, small dinosaurs that have feathers, some of which were probably capable of flying. And then people started to think, they look so similar, there's no way that's a coincidence. And there's still a bunch of crazy people who think they're not dinosaurs, but most people now agree they are.
And so there were dinosaurs that were just little bitty dinosaurs.
Yeah, there were a bunch of them. I mean, dinosaurs, outside of birds, they go through a whole range of body sizes. Some of them were very small, including some that are not close to birds at all. But yeah, so the group of dinosaurs that birds belong to is called the theropods. It includes all the two-legged carnivorous dinosaurs, so T-Rex, the raptors from Jurassic Park. They're actually pretty closely related to birds. And so you have this trend among that group of reduction in body sizes, progressive acquisition of filamentous structures that go progressively very close to feathers. And a lot of those characteristics that used to be associated with flight, actually, they were acquired in dinosaurs long before flight became a thing and long before birds existed. It just made flight easier once bird appeared.
That's amazing. And then, Carlos, one thing you and I were talking about beforehand is the sort of, could birds actually get it together to socially sort of cooperate and flock together for a common cause? Is that ever done?
Yes, for sure. So birds have a wide array of different social systems. They help each other. There's a famous example of, it's called helping at the nest. Usually there's about 300 different species across the world in which the offspring are retained with the family, and then as they grow up, then they start helping their parents breed and take care of their siblings. Mm-hmm. So they also kind of organize into big groups. We know, for example, that crows kind of there's lots of stories about how they help each other solve problems. Or recently in Alaska, it was shown how in a Walmart, for example, a couple of crows were terrorizing people, and or one of them was scaring the shoppers and the other one was stealing the meat from their packages. So they can definitely organize each other.
So, is there anything we could do to stop this?
Well, so I think to the level that we see here,
Yeah.
it would be a little bit difficult. But,
Yeah, but you yourself just said one figured out to terrorize the shopper and get him to drop the groceries, and that implies that if two can do it, why couldn't a whole flock do it?
Well, so there's actually a lot of really really interesting work showing that birds in particular can have lots of really strong kind of social behavior. They coordinate movement. They can do some pretty amazing feats. But the kind of all-out war that we see here, yeah. I don't think we have that. Maybe it's coming.
Clearly in this, the film is not real, right? But there's no sort of consciousness. I can't imagine that birds would have this sort of consciousness to, for example, they're looking down at the gas station burning and they're all yay. But do birds have any sort of what we would sort of consider consciousness above just mating and eating and foraging and so forth?
So one of the really interesting things about this movie is that, if I'm not mistaken, it was produced around the mid-'60s?
Yeah, early 60s, yeah.
Yes, early 60s. That point in time, we had very little understanding about the difference or the abilities that animals have, the cognitive ability. It would have been a point in time in which people would have said, there's no way that animals can think. And the so-called ornithologist in this movie says, oh, that's impossible. It took about 20 more years before Donald Griffin had a really like breakout book in which he kind of like demonstrated that there were lots of reasons to think that there's multiple different axes of cognition that we can actually see very clearly in animal minds. There's the ability to plan, there's the ability to recall information that happened a long time ago, there's the ability to solve problems, to organize in groups. I mean, like when we talk about intelligence and we talk about cognition, there's many different angles that we could think about. And in pretty much every angle that we claim, like superiority as a human, as the maximum species, we've discovered that there is actually like quite a bit of those abilities in other animals. Empathy, the ability to like organize, the ability to plan and to think ahead, to travel in the future and like think about the consequences, store something for later, all those kinds of like little things that we thought that they were like, oh, just like that's just human behavior. We're starting to realize, or not, we actually realized for quite a while that there's different levels in nature, not just in birds, but in many different animals.
So, Lucas, you're nodding vigorously, hearing this. Do you concur with these statements?
Yeah. Like you were talking about consciousness, like if I remember correctly, like some magpies, I think the common magpie is like the only known animal outside of humans that can like instantly have a sense of self in front of a mirror. Like so even chimpanzees or toddlers, you have to teach them how to do that. If you put a little piece of like sticking paper on a magpie in front of a mirror, they instantly know, like they take it out of themselves. They realize that it's them, and that so you have to be able to understand not only that it's a mirror, but like that the image is in reverse. Like that's a very complex cognitive process. So and magpies, by the way, are corvids, which is the same family as crows. So like many studies on cognition and behavior have been done on birds in that family because they have very advanced cognition. They have very advanced, very developed part of the brain that basically is our equivalent of like how to process information fast and use short and long-term memory in the context of like the visual input. So yeah, like I'm sure in a few years we'll discover even more in like other species.
Is there work being done on this currently, where we're understanding specific differences in bird cognition and consciousness?
Yes, quite a bit. There's many different types of work that has been done. Some experimental psychologists have been doing little tests like the mirror test, and I have to say, like in the last 20 years, we've seen many reports in which says like, oh, the only species that does this besides humans. The only reason they're the only species is because we haven't looked in enough species, because there's tons of species that do lots of these things. We've discovered, so there's research going on with parrots, for example, in which they've been kind of like subjected to a battery of tests. If you go on YouTube, you're going to find plenty of different kind of like examples of corvids, of New Caledonian crows, of parrots solving puzzles and doing things that look just kind of like impossible for like even us. Like you look at like, well, how do you solve that? And these guys kind of like start playing around and they do this. So that's on the experimental psychology part, but there's also like people like me that do comparative studies in which we try to figure out what are the benefits, what are the ecological benefits that may have driven the evolution of intelligence, and we compare across. I mean, this lady was talking about 8,000 species. There's closer to 11,000 species of birds, and we compare across all those species, trying to figure out what are the commonalities, what are the differences, what are the things that may have driven the evolution of intelligence. So there's plenty of different work going on that realm.
When we think of birds migrating, the concept of instinct does a lot of heavy lifting there. Oh, they know to do this, but how do they know where to go, how to get there? Do they follow patterns of wind? How do they do that?
Well, there's many different ways in which they do. Partly, there is some instinctual component. There's actually like some very famous work by Stephen Emlen in which you can see, for example, that some like at certain times of the year there's like this preferential places in which they fly, but there's also some part of learned behavior, and some animals learn from others and they group and they flock and they follow the more experienced leaders. It's all of the above, basically. There's also like some pretty amazing navigation abilities in birds. So like we were talking about before the movie, how like people tend to refer to bird brains as like somehow like suboptimal. And part of the reason for that is because the insult bird brain comes from the fact that birds as an animal, like when you compare other animals with them, they tend to have much smaller brains for their body size. But very recently, what we realized was that the density of neurons in a bird brain is almost 3 times the density of neurons in a mammalian brain. So that they are able to have a much smaller brain with basically the same computational capacity than much bigger animals. So for example, like a crow has pretty much the same computational capacity or more than a primate, than a relatively large primate. And we see this in the abilities that so there's millions of stories about things that crows and ravens can do that sound like just like, oh, this is made up. And so there's also like in parrots is the same thing. They like have this incredible vocal ability, this incredible social systems. They know each other, they exchange information, they help each other when they're needed. So there's a lot of that.
I want to get some questions from the audience in just a minute, but I do want to ask, since we've got both of you experts on stage, when it goes down, when the birds pull off their plan, which bird should we be most scared of?
Definitely crows.
Yeah, all corvids really well. Most corvids, yeah, they're very smart. They fly really well. I don't think like some of the large raptors, but honestly, they are less smart and they're less aggressive. Crows are very aggressive.
So the thing with so when we think about what intelligence and what cognition is used for, you realize that there's many different kind of like potential applications. So in some animals, for example, like the crows, the intelligence has been really fundamental to allow them to explore very different habitats that are not necessarily where you would expect a crow to be, and that has allowed them to be in like many different places and survive kind of like much more variable environments than other species. But there's other groups like parrots, for example, that use their intelligence to like find really difficult food. If you think about parrots, their mission in life is to find green fruits in a green background, and you need to do that, and they have to like predict when is it that tree is gonna have green fruits in like the entire year, and like it's a huge place. And while they have like mental maps that kind of like tell like, oh yeah, in January more or less I should go over there, they also have to rely on lots of information. So like that's another use of intelligence. But the bottom line is that parrots, crows, and gulls would be the ones that I would put my money on.
All right, making an important note of that. Let's go to our audience. Surely somebody has a question here. I see a hand right over here.
We have grackles, lots of them in Austin. I don't know, are they related to crows?
Are grackles, I'll just repeat it for our filming here. Are grackles related to crows?
They're Icteridae, which is it's not part of corvids, but it's pretty closely related. It's basically the ecological equivalent in North America. And they're pretty smart, yes.
Well, the reason I ask is because we have an HEB.
Hancock Center, right?
Hancock Center,
Yeah.
and I studiously avoid at dusk,
Yeah.
where they literally cover all the cars
Yep.
and they cover the ground. What benefit does it bring to them to gather like that? Why do they do that?
Well, many of those species, they have very opportunistic behavior. It's not necessarily trying to cooperate as much as this is where all the food is. We're all going to come together. And then if an opportunity arises, maybe they'll cooperate to steal food or like try to pick something that's a bit hard to access. But it's not necessarily like that they all decided together before coming that they will just come here. It's just like it makes it easier to find something.
So what like Hill Country Fair, like Idaho, like what kind of food are they getting at the HEB parking lot? It's like, what do they eat?
Well, that's the thing. So again, they're the ecological equivalent of crows. Crows are generalists. They eat pretty much anything. And actually, many species of crows, like ravens, common crows, they are kleptoparasites in some cases. They will just steal the food that other animals have hunted before, and they will just attack and steal it from them. And they can also do that from humans. So.
So has anyone ever had, because I've never had groceries actually stolen. Like there are a lot of birds there, but I don't know what the hell they're eating. Y- y-
So one thing with a lot of icterids, like the grackles, is that they tend to roost together at night. So during the day, they spread out, and at dusk, they all come to communal roosts. And that's a kind of behavior that is quite ancient for that lineage. So most of the icterids do the exact same thing. Not all of them are as aggressive as the grackles. The grackles are kind of like can be quite scary because they're a little bit big and they are like fearless. But one of the things that they do is that during the day, as you were saying, well, what do they eat? Well, they eat trash, they eat bugs, they eat whatever they can find, but there's not enough in the parking lot for everybody. So during the day, they spread out. But at night, they all come back together. So that's what you're seeing.
Is that aggressiveness that we've all observed in grackles, is that a learned behavior? Or is there something specifically sort of born into them that makes them aggressive birds?
Well, so there, it's both. But I would say that there's different animals have different strategies. Every organism in the world has kind of like to solve some basic problems. One of them is to survive. Another one is to like make more copies of themselves, to make some babies. And the way in which you go about doing those things is slightly different. So some animals do it by being aggressive. Some others do it by being kind of like coy and shy and difficult to find. Grackles just happen to have that strategy in which they just like have like the take it or leave it kind of attitude. But not all of their, like there's other icterids like very closely related that are way shyer than the grackles.
Yeah. I've never met a bird as much of a jerk as a grackle. Maybe we have another couple of questions from our audience. Who's got one? Everybody had the grackle question, I think. Yeah, right over here. What are your favorite birds? Incredible question.
That's a tough one. I still tend to really love ostriches, but that's mostly because I've worked a lot on them. And also, talking about a bird that's actually not smart at all, but can be kind of scary. A few years ago, for a project on evolution of ostriches, we ended up going to a little ostrich farm outside of Waco, and I ended up surrounded by 200 of them, trying to, with like a stereophonic microphone, trying to record the sound they make. And never again. But I still love them, so yeah.
What's your favorite bird, Carlos?
Well, I also don't have one. I mean, it depends on kind of like the mood. Here in Texas, for example, I really love the painted buntings. They're gorgeous little animals. I'm often very impressed by grackles, even though I also kind of like have this love-hate relationship with them, because like I'm very impressed and very like I see what they do and I feel like, wow, that's amazing. But then when they do it to me, I'm like, damn it. So anyway, so I also like, in fact, when I was looking at this movie, I was thinking like, I wish I could have been in that set, seeing the guy that probably like brought all those crows there, because probably they were trained, and crows are just amazing animals. They're like so intelligent. They're like, I've been in kind of like research stations where they kind of like have New Caledonian crows that are kind of like top of the line, and if you think about the models of crows, and they're like really like, they make you second guess everything about kind of like intelligence. You really see kind of like that they look at the world in a very inquisitive way. So like, I love that. And I also love kind of like other birds that are just like pretty. So like I was born in Colombia, and there's a ton of like really colorful birds there. Like they're called tanagers. Like there's one group of tanagers. They're really gorgeous animals. There's something that's called the cock of the rock, which is like this red and orange thing. Like anyway, I could talk for hours about cool things here.
Birds are great, despite what you just saw. Yeah, right over here. Is there an ornithological reason for keeping them in separate cages?
There's an ornithological reason for not keeping them in cages. I think so. I would never ever have an animal in a cage. I think that is a travesty. And part of the reason why you don't keep animals in cages is because usually, if you think about, even small little birds tend to have huge ranges, and restricting them to just a tiny little space, it's really stressful. And when you add other animal into the same cage, even if it's the same species, it becomes kind of like it's too much. Like there is such concept of personal space in animals, and it's actually like pretty well developed. And animals become really aggressive once they kind of like that space is impinged upon. Sometimes it's even worse to have two of the same species in a cage than two of different species, because that immediately is perceived as a threat. But I guess the whole overall thing is like, don't keep birds in cages.
You heard it here first. I see a hand right over here.
So a group of crows is called a murder. Is that a coincidence, or are they going to kill us?
Group of crows is called a murder. Is that a coincidence, or are they all going to kill us?
I mean, they would probably kill us anyway, regardless of how they're gone. But no, like I wonder, if like I don't know anything about like the linguistics behind it, but I wouldn't be surprised if like, seeing how both insanely smart and insanely opportunistic they are, maybe that's actually where the denomination comes from. But also, I don't know, the medieval representation of animals can be so weird that I honestly have no idea.
Yeah. Who knows why? Does anybody know why they're called murders? Any linguists know why they're called murders? Because it's a weird thing to call a group of animals a murder. Let's face it. Let's get maybe one more question from our audience, and then we'll. Who's got just a great question?
Can I say something really quick about
please,
that?
Yeah.
I was going to say that I recently spoke to a farmer that was telling me that more than crows, he was afraid of his turkeys. And that he said that if he was feeling sick or woozy, he would never walk into his turkeys where he keeps the turkeys, because he was afraid they were going to kill him.
I've heard are turkeys very smart?
Not at all.
Not at all. All right, tough hit on turkeys. I think the hand over here I saw first, right over here.
Hi, I have a question, and then my friend has a question, if that's okay. I had also been wondering about ancient birds previously, and was wondering, so did all birds kind of descend from the same theropod ancestor, or did a bunch of different theropods kind of evolve to have feathered wings?
Did birds evolve from a common theropod ancestor?
That's a very good question. So yes and no. So all birds come from the same theropod ancestors. Like they're part of a family called Aviale, which has a bunch of well, it's not a family, it's an order, but it has a bunch of like close relatives that, if you looked at the general structure of their limbs, most of them had very clearly developed feathers, and most of them really looked like birds. But then, when it comes to the origin of flight and the origin of feathers, there has been recent studies that suggest that flight, or some form of flight that was probably not exactly the same as in modern birds, may have been acquired by some close relatives of birds, so close to that group. And that would be dromaeosaurids and not troodontids, dromaeosaurids, which are the group that Velociraptor, for example, belongs to, because these guys had feathers, and some of them might have been capable of flying, or maybe taking off a little bit, even though obviously they were not giant soarers. And then there's also another group of theropods, also pretty close to birds, that has a very long name that I'm not gonna pronounce now. But they're really weird. They have wings, but not with feathers. They have something more like bats. They have like membranes between their fingers. And they've only been discovered about like 10 years ago. There's only like 3 or 4 species of them. And we don't actually know. They look like they were able to fly, but there hasn't really been much done on them so far to prove that they were able to do that. So they might have been several origins of flight, but it's not very clear.
Go for it.
I just wanted to ask about pigeons. They're like my favorite bird, and they are also like they're a very monolithic bird in many urban areas. I just want to hear y'all's thoughts on that.
Thoughts on pigeons?
Well, I'm actually working on pigeons right now, and I think that they're pretty amazing too. They get a really bad rep. People kind of like tend to say that they're like pretty dumb. But one of the things that I really love to point out is that pigeons can have like really amazing navigational skills. They can like homing pigeons, for example, are famous for their ability to like go anywhere without having a map. And they really can go back to the spot, which requires pretty incredible abilities. They have been one of the few species. So again, we have around 11,000 different species of birds. And of those 11,000, we know the inner workings of the brain in about 5 if we're lucky. And for those 5, we know little bits of this part or this other part. But pigeons is one of those places or one of those species that we really know a lot of. And so they've been kind of like, there's a lot of work going on trying to understand kind of like how the connections within the brain of the pigeons, how they actually in the end produce ideas, produce behaviors. Like they have taught us a lot, and I'm very grateful to pigeons for that.
Let me ask you too, how angry were you at the ornithologist in this film for dropping all that misinformation? Does it upset you?
Well, I'm actually not that angry because I realized like we've come a long way since the 60s.
Yeah.
And it is kind of like, I see this movie as a commentary of the clash between modern life and nature. And I feel that this is kind of like, that ornithologist kind of like talks a little bit to the idea that there's like this human hubris at the time in which we thought we're so different. But at the same time, we have kind of like that perception we haven't forgotten quite yet, that when we go out to the field, we do see that animals kind of like behave intelligently, they organize, they do groups. So this is obviously exaggerated, but you realize that whoever wrote the book in which this movie is
Daphne du
based,
Maurier, yeah.
she knew things that were happening, and there's little things little bits in the movie that to me make me think a lot about my work, and also like kind of like the history of ornithology, and also like random stuff, like for example, like what's up with those lovebirds? Like they're more than just the story about like, oh, the 2 lovebirds that get together. They also making a statement about, you know, like pets are less frightening. Pets are kind of like the things that we have, the way that we interact with animals in the city or in places that we've excluded nature from. But wild animals are scary because we don't know them, and nature can be scary because we don't understand it very well. And I think that that's a nice part of this movie and the commentary that it makes.
Absolutely.
No, I completely agree, and I was thinking the same actually rewatching it just now. We've come a long way, like that ornithologist lady just says, you know, oh, there's like 8,600 species now. There's way over 10,000 species of birds described. Archaeopteryx is not really considered a bird anymore. There's been so much progress that's been done, and somehow this is right around the time in the history of our field where, you know, in the 70s, this is when people started thinking that birds might be dinosaurs, that the, you know, endothermy is the ability to produce their own body heat that we thought was only in birds was actually acquired among dinosaurs. People started to see similarities in bone microstructure, in a whole bunch of different things. And now all of things are pretty well established. They're scientific fact. We know that all of this is part of their evolutionary history. So it's interesting to see like this little time capsule of right before all that scientific revolution happened.
And also this is the time in which like we were going to the moon and we were doing all these other things that were like really kind of like saying like, oh, humans are just so intelligent. We were like patting ourselves in the back, like, oh, we're like the great things. And this is the time in which we start realizing that progress has its problems and it clashes with other kinds of things. So I think that this kind of like movie is kind of like showing that kind of like the beginning of the realization that is not just about us, but maybe about the other things that we live in with.
Excellent way to sum it up. I'd like you two are so cool. I could talk to you about birds for hours. I would like to thank, and I'm sure all of you would also like to thank our guests, Carlos Botero and Lucas Legendre. Thank you both for coming. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.